Radio Show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV Radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us, and I want to thank our affiliate, KEPW.org, here in Eugene, who's carrying our show. And I want to thank them also for carrying Libby Halevi's show, Nuclear Hot Seat. We make an effort to bring voices and information to you that really other places don't give the time and effort. They might give them a few minutes, but we like to be repeat customers and have people on again to fully vet this new time of living in the age of fission. So on that vein, I have with us a personal friend, and a friend of our show, Heide Lambert. Heidi. Heidi. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having us, Lonnie, or having me.
Yeah, and in all full disclosure, this is a pre-recorded interview at 6 p.m. on 10/24. It's probably going to air a week from Wednesday, not tomorrow, because it's too short notice for me just to give it to Jules in one day and expect her to have it on. So it'll probably be on next Wednesday. But thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be on the show and have a platform to talk about things that most people don't normally want to talk about.
Well, not only that, you lived in Hanford, right? Like, you lived in the Tri-City area most of your life.
Yep.
Your dad worked at Hanford.
Yep.
What he knew there drove him crazy, essentially. Put him on disability at an early age, caused him to have an early death. The contamination has affected many members of your family, tragically.
Yeah, sadly that is true. And I have friends and family who still live in the Tri-Cities area, and Moses Lake, Spokane, over to Walla Walla, and to the other side into Yakima. So I've had lots of family, many generations who've lived in eastern Washington.
Are you saying that Walla Walla is not a safe place to live for the contamination, for those of us who aren't very clear on the geography?
There is a lot of studies showing that the wind blows from the Tri-Cities east, and Walla Walla is due east of the Tri-Cities.
So why don't we buy Walla Walla onions?
Because they're good. Sadly, that's a sad joke, because I do really enjoy Walla Walla onions, but they do absorb a lot of potassium and minerals out of the soil. And my whole upbringing, I was raised by farmers who really enjoyed being in the soil and working in the environment. And it wasn't until like the late 1990s that I started to realize that most likely most of those foods were contaminated to some level with the radiation fallout of the Hanford radiation.
Well, does it give you comfort to realize that now practically everybody's contaminated?
No, it doesn't bring me comfort. It brings me sadness. And when I did live in the Tri-Cities area as an adult, it's where my husband and I actually had one of our children. And it was really sad for me to leave there because I felt like that was a place that I had inherited and that it was part of my history, my ancestry.
Why did you leave?
And
why did you leave?
because my mother had died and I had really sick family, and I just not my children and not my husband, but actually we were sick, and we were always having allergies and stomach sicknesses, and truly my husband toured Hanford. He wasn't from there. He was from West Virginia. And so when he toured the B reactor, they actually have this once-a-year tour, and it's really hard to get seats, and they take all these reporters, and they take them to the reactor and show them, where this was all started. And when you're walking in, there's a fence, and they say, on one side of the fence is contaminated, but on your side of the fence it's fine.
Safe side of the fence. There's an excellent documentary about St. Louis for that very thing, safe side of the fence.
Safe side of the fence, yeah, totally. And meanwhile, the wind is blowing and the dust is going right through your chain link fence.
You're on the chain link fence, and over there, they're in hazmat suits, and you're eating your bologna sandwiches.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened. And he came home and burned his clothes and said, "We're leaving." And I fought. At first I was like, no, we can't go. It took like 2 months to get me. He actually honestly left without me, and I finally followed him. And when we did, we ended up on the coast just months after Fukushima. And so here I thought I was moving away from it and honestly just into a different atmosphere of it. And so now I live in Newport, Oregon now, where it's the forefront of the research being done on Fukushima on the Pacific is happening right here with the universities of Oregon. So that's kind of ironic.
And yet you guys go in the water there. Yeah,
I do. I surf and do a surf camp with kids.
I mean, don't you worry? I mean, like for me, I would be very upset if my daughter allowed my grandchildren to go in the water. Honest to God. I mean, I know it's bad enough we can't keep them out of playing in the dirt, and we can't keep them out of, like, swimming in the rivers, which aren't as bad as the ocean, though.
It depends, I wouldn't want to put my body in the Mississippi. I mean, the Mississippi is all down river from
That's actually true.
Many
you know what, and you were right about that. Like, that's what I mean when I said this at the top of the show. And for full disclosure to our listeners, I have interviewed Heidi about her experience of living there and asked her to draw out her emotions and tell stories from her past, which really goes against the grain for that community up in the Tri-Cities. It is kind of breaking a broken rule to speak, and it can hurt people that she cares about and loves. So,
right, it's a challenge. It's definitely
what has happened since you've been on here in your relationships? Or what's been their response? Is anybody up there that's listened to these things?
Well, it is interesting because when I was in the Tri-Cities the last bit of my life, which was like 5 years ago, it was right, or 6 years ago now, I guess, it was right after Fukushima is when I left. And I was really vocal then. I was raised, my dad was an engineer. He was actually a weapons designer at Hanford. And so my whole upbringing, he was very critical, and he had lots of opinions about what was happening there. And usually the societal climate was that he was the one that was paranoid and he was the one that was crazy. And then as I grew older and went back there as an adult, the more he was validated and the more that I understood that a lot of those things that he said happened really did happen. And so I started sharing that with my...
What do you mean, like really did? Like what? Like the waste, the way they just...
Oh, like the water was contaminated. Like if you were to talk to someone who works what they call out in the area, they're going to tell you it's safe. They're going to tell you that everything's contained and everything's safe and it's a very controlled environment. But my dad, when he worked there, different situations happened And one of the ones that I'll never forget was a man hit a bird, or no, a cat killed the bird, and he had it in his car. And he took his car back into Hanford, and the bird was hot. And so the bird feathers from the remains of what his cat had eaten at his house.
Wow.
And so it's that realization that these cooling waters were out in the open, and that anything in the wild, could get to them, and things like flu, insects, and then you start learning about the food chain and what eats those things. And, just the whole atomic science, so many people just don't understand. It's so small. It's so hard for people to understand the reality of what atomic means, And so I was raised with really seeing that happening. And then having, my own kids there, when after our daughter was born, there was radioactive rabbit droppings that were found in construction sites of houses that were being built out beside the area. And so just things like that was just weird validations to me. The radioactive bees all of a sudden became a very real, what would be a sci-fi movie became real in a lot of different ways.
The Godzilla element, you mean? Like we'd have this big 10-foot gigantic bee, a mutated bee, where the species starts to grow to be 2 feet long. Wouldn't that be weird?
Well, it wasn't more like...
It's actually more the opposite. What we're seeing is that they're being exterminated. We are in... Scientists literally are pretty much in agreement. We are in the 6th extinction. And mammals are dropping off at a faster rate than they have in any previous extinction.
Well, and that's kind of happening with the ocean, too. That's what they're seeing, is that the microorganisms are what is going away, and then that affects all the food chain.
Well, it's all the pollution. It's nuclear. It's chemical. Brian Porter talks about, the cargo ships, like the shipping lines. They are horrendously, they create more pollution than all the cars on the planet.
Right.
Like by magnitudes, and we're not even thinking about that. We talk about our cars, but they go out in the middle of the ocean, and how long can the ocean sustain that type of destruction and assault? It's basically an assault on the planet. This is my objection. See, it is the silencing, though. This is, excuse me, but I really want to get back to this thing about your culture where you grew up on the Tri-Cities and this. I think where we went wrong in American culture and with our idea of who we are as Americans is acquiescing to this secrecy, to the deferral to the smart people. Like, that's why Trump wants us to believe him, because he's such a great businessman. We have to defer to him because he knows how to do it. And we defer to the generals because they gave up their lives for us. So we can't question them. Right. And this is the thing. The hallmarks of democracy are based on 3 things: participation of the public, and competition, and liberty. And you cannot stifle any of those to have. And this is why today is the day that Jeff Flake gave his big kind of shocking statement that he's not going to run. He's not going to let Trump drag him into the ground. He's going to go do something else to try to stop really the destruction of what we're seeing as the base of our country. This is really Steve Bannon, by the way, is a self-avowed Stalinist. He is not an American advocate who believes in the real America is what's considered a liberal democracy, because basically at heart we say government should stay out of our business. That's the big argument in America. So he is a person who believes in control of the state. He thinks we need to knock out all of our institutions and just restructure it and let the people who know how to run it run it. We're talking about serious. I'm proud of Jeff Flake myself today.
Well, there's a lot of denial in what you're saying, and that's something that I have anxiety about every day, is that these nuclear waste sites and these generators don't run themselves. They don't run themselves. And these programs were developed out of the war. I mean, it was the Defense Department who runs these places, and as the years have gone, the decades have gone by, they've tried to change it more into a power, that we need nuclear for power, but really it still bottoms out as defense, because if we cut the funding to say like the security of these waste sites, and someone gets in there, they can do a lot of damage with really just a tiny little bit of this stuff. And so that gives me anxiety, because we need to continue funding the security of these sites and the science behind these sites.
Well, so then this is our challenge. Donna Gilmore has a website, sanonofresafety.org, with all the information about H.R. 3053, Nuclear Waste Policy Amendment Act of 2017. Now, whether it passes or not, I don't think it will pass, but let's just say, I think we could use this as a way to use this as like, this is what these people are thinking of doing, privatizing nuclear waste.
Sure, because it's as sure as death. You know you're going to always have job security. This stuff's going to be around for tens of thousands of years. Tens of thousands of years.
I know,
Lonnie.
but you know what we need to have? We need to have a real honest conversation about the level of contamination. People need to not be afraid to say it. We don't have to apologize for us being dumb at. Excuse me, I'm not going to cuss because of KEPW, but you know what I mean?
Right,
I mean,
but we have to. But it's easier to be in denial. It's definitely easier.
It's
to
not easier because death is not easy. There are things we can do to prevent our children from getting sick, from doing things. We can keep them off. We know for a fact there's studies that are showing that sugar is like an attraction to cancer. So why have a sugar-heavy diet? Allow your children to have sugar-heavy diets because it's easier. You can give them fast food. They'll go right to sleep. And it attracts them, and we know they're in a contaminated environment. Not just nuclear. I mean, listen to Erica Dugan on our show. She is a victim of fracking and the chemicals. She knows exactly. The name of the chemical that harmed her family is unbelievable. That's one of the things Larry Bergen and I were talking. It's not just the nuclear; it's all the other stuff. Like, it's
the fracking is nuclear. Fracking does take radiation. They do use nuclear to frack.
Well, I have been told that they don't use nuclear to frack, but what happens is when they frack, they loosen up all the uranium, so all the uranium comes up, so you get tailings.
Oh, that could be too. I just know that there is.
I think they use, that's what I asked somebody to look into it. I asked Jerome Hebert. He's going to be on our show, by the way. You'll hear this, you'll know this by Thursday. I'm going to announce it tomorrow, so you'll hear this next Wednesday again. Jerome Hebert, the sane environmentalist, he's a new activist. Again, this is why Kevin Blanch's voice is really great that he's out there. He was hearing him, and he went, what? He didn't realize it was so bad. So he started to do his own research and thought, well, hey, he has a whole different manner. He's a very calm person. He's going to be on with us Friday also. But he looked into this for me, Heidi, and I asked him, he researched and he said no, could not see where they were using nuclear waste, but I don't think they're going to tell us. I think it's the secret ingredient that Dick Cheney had secret. Dick Cheney got that before they left office. That was his big last act as a legislator, was to make on the fracking. Him and Obama, they negotiated. You know, Obama negotiated with the Bush crime family and all of them before he even got into office. He was already talking to everybody. He was strictly business. He was in there to do their business, and he did. He stood in front of us and told us that nothing was wrong in Fukushima, and let us continue to have the NRC put our lives at risk.
Right. Yeah. I don't know why the human life is collateral damage when it comes to nuclear waste, but it doesn't seem to really count in the calculations of loss.
You know what I think it is, Heidi, is they don't believe that it really causes the harm. Because they look at you like you've grown up in the Tri-Cities, your kids are fine, you're fine, you have had a happy life, things in your life are good. I mean,
but the sneaker of radiation is that it's a gene. It can cause genetic damage, and then that comes out generations later. And I don't think that everyone. I think that it's such a new science that we really don't know. Like, we know that cancer is caused by radiation, but there's probably a lot more of like a mental.
That's actually true. John Goffman. John Goffman determined that schizophrenia is like one of the first things. Mental illness happens right away. It does create something different in your brain. And they stopped investigating it. I mean, this is why we don't have research. They're like, well, there's no research about that because nobody does research about it.
Right. Well, because there's no money for the research. That's the interesting thing about nuclear science is the money only goes one way. It's only research that's for it and shows that it's good, and like with the levels, how they just keep changing the safe levels of how much is safe for us to take in. And then there's not really, you would think like all of our foods would be being tested all the time for cesium, and nobody tests our food. And so it's easy to buy into these conspiracy theories that they know what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose. And to me, I
don't call it a conspiracy theory, though. I don't.
It's not. To most, it's not. It's that we believe that they really are poisoning our food. They know it. They're feeding it to us, and then they're trying to cure our cancer with more radiation.
And they don't think it's that bad to get cancer because you can survive now. Like it's just,
well, they definitely minimalize it.
They think,
but they're not talking about the other risks. That's the other thing, is that there's other risks that aren't even being named, or
even being studied. This is what I mean. Yes, we are going to have this nuclear waste around for hundreds of thousands of years. It is our responsibility as a species to the Earth to figure it out. But in the meantime, it doesn't mean we have to live in denial. We don't have to feel secrecy. We don't have to deny that the microencephaly babies up in Hanford were caused by nuclear contamination. I mean, someone's dealing with their health care anyways. So what? If we're sorry we did that. It was part of the war effort. We had no idea it would last this long, and we're doing the best we can. That would be a great answer.
Right, but that's not the solution. The solution is to deny it, to have secrets, to continue to make it.
To pretend like it doesn't matter. To be honest, that boat show, and yet, you know what? Matt Holstrunk, who takes the testing he comes on our show every 6 to 8 weeks. He tests the EPA's radiation levels and compares it. He has a really good Geiger counter, and he goes out and tests where they test right next to there. They're pretty equal. He tracks them, right? And from what they publish on their website. And he went camping and swimming and surfing in the Columbia River. Right down from right near there.
Right, like
and
Longview?
He's like, you know what, it is not worth, I'm how old? It is not worth me giving this up. I'm not going to do it.
Right.
I don't know.
Didn't go in.
I don't know. Like, for me, I could not go and enjoy myself.
At the ocean or at Tri-Cities?
At the Tri-Cities or the ocean.
Right.
I can't enjoy myself in Los Angeles either, because in Los Angeles I literally get sick. The water there is literally so contaminated. You get sick.
Yeah, well, it's like Japan, Lonnie. It's like, I would love to go to Japan, but I would be afraid to go to Japan. And even right now with the typhoons that are hitting Japan, Japan has way more reactors, than in that concentrated. I want to say they have something like 27 reactors on their island.
Not only that, but they've moved that waste around. Like, there's big piles of waste way on the outside. Look at where Fukushima Prefecture is. They've moved it all over, and they have directly moved it to incineration places. And, I mean, it is... With those typhoons, it's bad.
I think the same thing of the fires outside of Portland.
Yes.
You know, all of those those trees are over 100 years old. Those trees were older than radiation, older than Hanford. And Hanford has been spewing radiation for 60 years on all those trees.
Plus all the 50s and 60s testings that happened, everything from that. Plus Chernobyl.
Yeah,
plus Mount St. Helen.
Sure, so it goes up in the wind and goes and blows around, and who knows where in the world it falls down on. And that's when you say to me about us living in a contaminated world. I'm sad to say I'm very confident that we are living in a contaminated world. It's not just Hanford, it's worldwide. There's countries who test their bombs in other countries. I mean, and with total ill regard to the people who live there.
Like the United States, where our drone bombings are using depleted uranium weapons, and we are bombing innocent civilians.
Or in the United States, where we did all the above bombing in the Southwest, where all of the indigenous people had been all shoved down into Arizona and New Mexico, and we bombed for 2 decades, their whole grounds. Or all the abandoned
the EPA says there are at least, if you go to their website and look up abandoned uranium mines, it says at least 15,000 uranium mines. I wonder, I'm going to go look there. So
crazy.
How does this affect your relationship with people in your family that are still part of the Tri-City?
So I think, going back to it, okay, so, you know, people know me. They know my dad. So people who are my family, you know, always knew we were this like black sheep, or these people who weren't buying into it. So people, I think, now kind of expect that from me. They expect my cynicism about the whole thing. But lately, anyways, and honestly, since I've done the radio show, I think we've been doing a radio show a month for the last year, Lonnie, and I share them online and on my Facebook. And so lately, family members have been saying to me that they've listened to the show, and that they really were listening to what I had to say, and they heard truth in it. And I don't try to say that I'm a scientist, and I don't try to say that I know everything. I'm just like everyone else. I'm just trying to struggle with what I know and trying to put science, you know, science has changed a lot in the last couple decades, you know. But it did mean a lot to me to have cousins and family members, you know, and I do have family members who won't listen or talk to me about it, you know, so there's still that. But the fact that some people really did say to me that they were listening to this and that it was affecting them on how they thought about their jobs and how they did what they do in the Tri-Cities. So I think that is why this is so important, even though it's so hard to talk about it, because people doubt and challenge and say that we don't know what we're talking about and that it's conspiracies and we're paranoid. You know what I mean? You can have so much self-doubt. I honestly didn't even know if I wanted to do the show this time because I just thought, oh my gosh, you know, who am I? Who am I to say something? You know, I'm just some kid who grew up in the desert. But the truth is that I did see Hanford have to, I mean, when I was growing up, they would refuse to admit that any radiation had leaked into the river. And then when I went back in my 20s, my late 20s, and was there, and now all of a sudden it became a cleanup. And it was all about trying to save the river from the leaking contamination. And so it's like they can only lie so long, and we're in the infancy.
Well, when did that happen? When did you hear about that? That was around when? 2010?
I'd say 2010. It was like 2010 is when it started to be where they couldn't deny it anymore, and they had to admit that they didn't have that control on those tanks. Mm-hmm. And then just lately, you know, this last spring, they had the tunnel collapse, and they were starting to talk about how, I mean, when I lived there, they would deny even that there was tunnels. It it's such a top secret thing because it is the Department of Defense that there's so much secrecy over what is it really all there, you know? And when you drive there, Lonnie, it's hard to even know where you're at. You would not even know where you can drive right through it.
It looks like a desert. It really does. And the posts are old. There's really, and they put the sign, like it's very, when we drove up there, we could barely find it. It's very eerie. It feels like a Twilight Zone desert ghost town.
It really is. It's a lot. And when you're there, there's all these wineries and whining and dining and happy river scenes. It's very easy to forget that 10 miles up that river, there's a working reactor that's generating nuclear waste right now, much less I think it's one of the largest waste sites in the continental U.S., if not the whole northern hemisphere.
Before Fukushima, it was the most contaminated site on the planet. But now Fukushima is. It's only second to Fukushima. It's a very serious... This is my point, though, here, because you come from there. This is why I'm grateful that you will come on and have this discussion, because I think it is time we grow up as adults on this issue and stop. Just change our behavior on this. Just let's be reasonable adults about it. It has happened. Okay. Let's stop the bleeding and the nuclear power entire program, because we can go to alternatives immediately. Anything else is better than nuclear because we do not know what to do with the waste. I found out today from Donna Gilmore that, those half-inch thick containers, 5/8-inch thick containers she's found out about, and how weak they are and how really they're risky to have. Remember this conversation? We were talking about it today, and we were looking at she found a brochure from Arvida. They want the EPA, they put in a request to have them loosen the regulations so they will allow them to take radiation tests, because they have to have these outside containers, but the radiation is so hot that you have to have vents in the containers, right?
Wow.
And so they want to have the radiation levels taken at the intake. And they want to have the rates raised by 0.03%. They want to raise the level to allow them more. To do with, this was really hilarious. They wanted to do with away with, what was the title? Onerous, oh my gosh. This is the words. I'm going to use their own words. Elimination of cause of spurious alarms. Because it just makes people, this is what they're saying, these alarms, they literally say this in their little brochure. It says, this small temperature increase limit for these containers results in spurious alarms, necessitating visual inspections to ensure there is no blockage of the vents. So they're basically saying, raise the limit so we don't have to keep running out there to look to make sure it's okay.
Right. So start us up higher, because then it won't go,
This is Areva. This is so outrageous but this gets to the heart of what we're talking about, like the nuclear denial. The people that you love, that you grew up around, like, look at you. Your husband had to leave you before you decided to leave. You said so yourself. You
and that's even with my family. Yeah, no, it's hard. It's really hard. And also, I mean, people are making good incomes, and they have these big fat houses, and, it is scenic. And so if you have everyone around you telling you that you're being paranoid and there's nothing to be afraid of, and the other thing is that you sit and you think, well, God, everyone I know has cancer. But the conversation is how that is like that everywhere. And so you start to feel like you can't escape it. Well, and that's where my own personal irony kind of comes from, because I moved to the coast thinking I was escaping it, and moved into this wilderness, and I, live very rurally, and yet I'm as exposed to radiation as everybody else. Like, there is no escaping it. And that goes with growing your own food, like, bless the people who want to eat well, but if you're letting your food grow where radiated rain is falling, you're going to be contaminated. Like, it happens.
Well, if this is the reality, everybody eats food that gets contaminated rain on it. I mean, really, honestly.
Yeah,
the water
for
supply,
sure.
We cannot get the tritium out of the water. The best water still has tritium and nitrates.
Sure.
And nitrates. It is beyond comprehension. When we talk about the water protectors, it's very interesting that people identify themselves as water protectors and take a great sense of pride about it, and yet feel like talking about nuclear contamination is just pointless. To me, I don't know how you can separate the two. They go together.
Well, and you need water to have reactors. Because it is so hot. So it's an instant contamination, and the radiation instantly goes to hydrogen, and that's what they saw with the leaking underground tanks at Hanford, was that it searched out, it found its way to the water, and that's what it's doing in our ocean. In a way, that's where Fukushima was a perfect storm, because it was flooded by the ocean. And it's all underneath the ocean, so that's so much easier for people to say they can't see what's happening. And then radiation, I mean, there's those 13 steps to decay, and the radiation's changing, too. And that's where it's at with this ocean, is the ocean is salt water. Salt, it's a mineral, well, so is radiation. It's a salt. And so it's kind of camouflaged, if you will, in the ocean, just as it's camouflaged in our soil. And that's where, you tell me that you would never go to the ocean or be able to go in the ocean. Well, I feel like then you shouldn't be able to breathe air, or eat, because to me that it's as contaminated. Our air and our earth is just as contaminated, and more so, I will say, around the sites. Like Hanford, I'm sure it's like a 500-mile radius from that site that's contaminated, heightened. But then, like you said, Mount St. Helens is just miles from that, and so when that exploded, it pushed all those contaminants that was on that mountain eastward, for the length of our continent, and who knows how much was in rainwater that went around the world. Mm-hmm. So even though we're talking at an atomic level, it's big on how far it can go, and that's where I think that the denial is. We're still in this denial of how much we're surrounded by it and how hard. There is no cleaning it up. Like, there's no collecting it. There's only a decaying.
Well, it's not the idea. We can't collect it, but we can admit that we're being contaminated, and we can look at ways to prevent maximum contamination, to minimize how much exposure, because, it's one thing like to live in the Northwest and understand that we're living in rain that's contaminated. You keep the kids out of the rain and don't let them go play in the rain and get soaking wet like they did when you were a kid, because it will make them sick eventually. Not that they can't do it every once in a while, but they can't be like when we were, kids, we could just go out and slosh around in the water, and it was, although that's not true. See, we had that idea.
Yeah, no, when you did it,
I was born in 1955. So by the time I was 10 years old, the bombings were already bad. There was kids with polio in my neighborhood. I mean, it was really from the radioactivity. I remember that there was the real nuclear threat. I mean, we used to do the drop and hide things in school. We would get
and the fallout is real, and it's been going on for 70, 80 years.
But don't you think that's part of the denial? Is that part of the denial, Wendy? Heidi, because here we are all these years later, and we cannot talk about it still. We're not allowed
to. We're still not allowed to talk about it because it's still the choice of power. It's the choice of medicine. I mean, they're creating little small modular reactors to be able to put them in more places. when I say they, the nuclear scientists, they don't think there's anything flawed about nuclear science. They just think that they went too big, and that if they make it smaller, like on a submarine or on a satellite, then it's safer. I mean, I believe that there's uranium in our cell phone batteries to some degree. You know, we have it. It's so acceptable. It's so surrounded in our environments. And then the reality is that it's not going to go away. And then that goes back to just even, and this is really morbid, but if we have had radiation poisoning, that means those atoms are in our bodies. And so when our bodies are dead and decayed, those atoms are still going to be radioactive. They're not going anywhere, you know. So we're going to leave thought.
So, like,
yeah, there's cemeteries that are radioactive.
Every person who's been buried in since the nuclear bombings in the 50s and 60s testing, and they are still doing it here and there testing too. So every person that has been buried since then will have radioactive contaminants in their corpse forever. That way, if it gets picked up, will still be just as contaminating as it is. Actually, in many cases, it might actually be worse. That's the thing about nuclear exposure. Okay, so for us, it may not be that bad. It's a 27-year half-life, but then when it degrades into something worse. You know what I mean? That has a much more deleterious effect on our bodies. But this is my thing. We're the first generation to kind of get that, to grok it, as they used to say in the 60s. You know what I mean? Like, to really, like, get it at a deep level that, oh my God, we're in. There is no getting out of it. And in order for us to thrive as a species, really is, I believe, in my heart of hearts, we have to really rely on love and peace and have a change of heart and stop, live in authenticity and live at a higher vibrational level.
And I have a lot of, I'll admit I have a lot of denial, but I have a lot of hope, and sometimes they feed each other. But the hope is that they will find solutions.
See, I kind of think hope is a bit of a denial, right? Don't you think hope is?
Yeah, and it is a bit of a denial, but I do, I get, when people say you can't stop nuclear science. We've gone on, I want to say, I think it's 100 to a 90 of our elemental chart is natural, and from 90 to 120 are fake synthetic atoms that we've created since we've created the nuclear science. So it's almost half of our elemental chart. Nuclear science will
stop itself, Heidi. Nuclear science is going to stop itself. And in fact, this is why since I found out about Fukushima and really understood what that meant and started really like what you say, these nuclear radioactive contaminants, Helen Caldicott says all the studies show 4 to 8 generations is when the worst of it shows up. The most dramatic deformations show up 4 to 8 generations. What happens within the first or second generation is sterility. So that's a very, you cut down the species, and then 4 to 8 generations later, you have the species deformed or something happens and they cannot reproduce. A further breaking down of the species, in 100 years, we might only have 2,000 or 3,000 humans on the planet. That's a good possibility, considering the fact that they have ignored the danger.
Well, and that's exactly what happens with all the insects.
That's what's happening.
Because the insects go sterile, and then we start seeing this huge die-off.
Yeah.
And then the larger mammals who feed off those insects follow, and they start their die-off. And so 8 generations from now, we're going to start seeing, more and more sterility and defects in humans.
Whether we admit it or not. See, there's 2 conversations here. I've been having sort of an internal push-pull about being on this radio show and interviewing people and drawing this and having this conversation out, because I am angry that our elected officials are abdicating their responsibility to know about this. This is a grave matter. And there is just too much evidentiary information. Fukushima happened, and we are now having massive mammals. Something happened, something catastrophic is happening, and we know it's obvious. The Wasting's disease is ridiculous. It's radioactive contamination, and it's also
not calcification.
It's not climate change. It is environmental collapse. The climate is changing because the environment is collapsing.
But I think that, honestly, most of our science, like the colleges that teach the core sciences, is funded by the federal government. So if the federal government is, at a core in denial about the damages and the criticalness of this nuclear science, and all they're chasing is the dollar, the money that they think that they're making, then from the very top, we're being taught that it's okay. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's where we don't have colleges studying the damages. We don't have, the EPA is poorly funded. I don't even know if it's still open. All of these checks and balances we don't have anymore because it's so pro. And that's the other thing about nuclear science is so interesting. Like Hanford was all paid for by taxpayers. So it was like, I want to say it was the biggest bonds to go bad. Like, people bought bonds for Hanford. It was called WHOOPS. That was the abbreviation. It was like Washington, Hanford, something operations. I don't even remember what it stood for. And they were supposed to build like 7 reactors. And after the first reactor, they stopped building them and went default. And who lost? It was the taxpayers. That's why this is such a fraud, is because the people are just making money instantly off of building it, and then the people are left with the mess. And that's the expense, is the mess.
You know what? Can you hang on just a second? Someone just answered my door. Hold on just one second. Hold on.
Can I just bring the produce in?
Oh my gosh, I'm glad I answered the door. You know who that was? This is my friend John Miser, the community garden that I worked in over the summer. He's been bringing me fruit. He brings me food. He just delivers a little box of vegetables. So I'm glad I answered the door, so he's going to bring it in, so you're going to hear him. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm sorry about leaving you hanging there, Heidi. I hope you were singing or something. I'm not going to edit this. We'll just leave it. But see, this is my whole big point here is I honestly am wondering how we are going to communicate with, like, your family members. Because your people are the ones who are actually the ones... your people are the ones who are really affected by it all, correct?
Well, you could say that we're the first wave.
Yeah.
But I think that everyone's affected by it, and that's why I do the radio show, Lonnie, because I think that sometimes when you grow up next to a reactor and you do see so many people die of cancer, it's more validating, so it's easier for me to speak this truth, where other people who maybe didn't grow up around a reactor and just, watch The Simpsons is more in denial of really what's going on with our rain and our snow and our irrigation water that feeds to our vegetables. That's what I think is that you can live next door and be in denial, but you can live away from it and never been, you know what I mean? And it's an easier denial, but it's all still denial. We all have to face it. We all have to face
and in a way, we also all have to kind of live in denial, Because if you really focused on it 24 hours a day, it really does drive you bonkers. It makes you angry. You live in anger. This is why there's some activists that are just like bitter, angry people and constantly talking about it and just spitting nails. And rightly so. I agree 100%.
Where I would never say never go surfing or don't go swimming or don't go skiing. Like, that to me is not the solution.
That's not living. I get that point. It's like, at what point do you stop? My daughter said that, Mom, at what point do you stop living? I think like, you can go out in the rain, okay, once in a while, probably, who knows? But the fact is, there's some things that you can seriously avoid. Like, I don't think we should be eating fish at all. I think
but fish... see, to me, again, it's a false sense of security, though, to me.
Fish is so much more highly contaminated, Heidi. Like,
than milk, than cattle milk that comes from dairies that are grown right next door
dairy.
to it.
Exactly. The world would be better off if we eliminated dairy. Hello? I mean, honestly.
I think that's why dairy is bad for us. Is not the cow. It's because we've radiated the hay and we contaminated everything the cow eats and the air and the water.
That. I mean, really, literally for global. I mean, you want to like figure out they really do have a high emission of gas into the car. We have so many cattle on the planet. The planet literally would be better off if we would give up the cattle industry and stop with the dairy. But
what I'm saying is that when you start to go over what's more contaminated than not, that's kind of it's another one of those little games where we play on ourselves. That it's another part of denial. Like, oh well, if I don't eat fish, then I'm going to be okay.
No, not that you're going to. It's not that you're going to know.
What if you wall of sweets and you eat potatoes? You know, and those potatoes were grown right next.
Well, I don't see that again. Like, I am really like, I don't like to. I like to know where my rice comes from. Like,
and seaweed.
I have Boycott on my app. It's called Boycott. And it's a free app you can get, and you can scan all your food in the grocery store. Anything has a scanner on it, and it will tell you. Oh my goodness! I beg your pardon, you guys. I have a scanner that will tell you where your food comes from.
Yeah, and that's great. I think that's awesome, and I think
does it matter? So what you're saying is, does it really matter? I think it does. Because
it can, but we can't. But it's kind of a false sense of control. Is all I'm saying, Lonnie. That if we didn't eat right, I mean, first off, there's reactors everywhere. Like, there's so many countries that have nuclear reactors and waste. So many countries that have radiation. Just the fact of what I learned
today, the venting. What Donna Gilmore said, the venting. It's venting. Every single container vents 24 hours a day, at least carbon-14. And the cracking means that it allows bigger contaminants out, not that no contaminants are getting out. They know some are getting out.
Right.
24 hours a day. It's like we are all in literally the age of fission, folks. We've got 5 minutes left. I mean, I want us to have a conversation where, like, your relatives don't feel like you're invading their privacy or talking. You know, your friends aren't mad at you for talking because, A, it's not their fault, and B, there's no need to deny that this stuff causes us harm, and C, we don't need to deny that it's not there because it is there.
But they're defensive, though, Lonnie. I mean, to think that people aren't people are defensive.
What we need is a change of the industry. We need all those people working in the industry, but we need a change of focus. Instead of denying how we're going to do it the cheapest and we're just going to store it away, we need to focus a whole bunch of science on how do we remediate it, how do we reverse the atoms, how do we stop it, which I think we know through the microbes. There's scientific stuff on the microbes and mushrooms. Like, mushrooms are basically gigantic computers.
Right, yeah, and that's what makes me keep hope. That's why I get out of bed, you know, is I do believe that there'll be a solution, whether or not it takes
and I think it's going to come in a snap. I think it's going to be
I hope so.
I think it's going to, like, all of a sudden... because look what happened when we had all the pollution in the 70s and 80s before we got the EPA. Remember, the rivers were on fire. LA and New York, you could barely breathe. It was horrible. And within 10, 15 years, the air cleared up. The water started looking better. But then again, we were not dealing with this nuclear contamination. But I believe that we can find a solution.
Well, I do stay hopeful myself, and I try to enjoy life and talk to people about it without them being too defensive, but they know this is my truth, and I'm going to be as defensive of my truth as they're going to be of theirs. So the only way we can continue the conversation is just to be respectful of each other, that we do have different perspectives and contribute, the harm that's done to different things. But I think that that's the only way that they're going to see my perspective, and I try to see their perspective, but I do truly know, radiation does kill. We know that. And there is a real, natural, space radiation, and then there's straight up synthetic artificial elements that we created on Earth that turn to lead. And, that's what we got to deal with, containing, getting back, and recycling, and owning up and being accountable for the damages that we've done to people and the planet, and to water, and to everything,
Yeah, that is really it, and only through really this honest conversation can we... I think it's important, the whole thing about being accountable. I think that's an integral part of having a democracy, and that's where we have really lost sight of what's happened. Is they're so overly protective of their own systems that we're losing. That's what the secrecy is about. We must be able to have these open conversations. I think it's vital,
Yeah. Well, the first step of doing it is having them.
And thank you.
This
I want to thank
show
you.
has enabled me to do that with a lot of people who normally wouldn't. So it's kind of one-sided because it's just you and I talking, so they can't really interject their pessimism and then,
Well, we could do a live interview and give them the phone number if anybody wanted to call in, or they can send us comments. We have about a minute and a half left, Heidi. We've been listening to Heide Lambert. She's an activist, really tremendous human being. She works with children with disabilities and foster care kids, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's...
Yes, we do. And I also work with an organization called No Nukes Northwest. .org.
Me too.
And and really trying hard to get that organization.
We're not trying, we're doing. We're getting it together. So we have our plans that we're making, and you'll be hearing more about us. We brought in Amber King. So look, I really appreciate this conversation that we can have about just admitting it and not being miserable or freaked out and scared. Because we don't need to be that way. There's no need to live like this, because guess what, folks? We are in the age of fission, and there's no real getting around it. So we can just decide to enjoy ourselves, and like I say, happiness is resistance. It actually does build up. You raise your energetic level, you harmonize at a higher level, energetic level, and you will be less prone to illness, and things work out for you in a much better way. So...
Thanks, Lonnie.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you guys. We'll be on the air shortly, Monday through Wednesday for sure. And put your courage feet on. Take some action. Contact your elected officials and tell them no on HR 3053, and to change course on the nuclear industry. And let's look for solutions and discuss and be honest about what it really does to our families, our lives, and our planet. We'll talk to you guys later. Ciao.